debugging Mule applications. In Anypoint Studio, we have the ability to add breakpoints to processors and step through those breakpoints in the app. We can watch a message and its variable values as they change. We can create expressions and watch those evaluate as we move through. By default, the debugger in Studio listens on incoming TCP connections for localhost port 6666. You can change this in your project's run configuration. And we call this out here because there are times where certain firewalls or machines are blocking port 6666 and it needs to be changed accordingly. So let's get right into debugging. In Walkthrough 5.2, debug a Mule app. We'll locate the port used by the Mule debugger in case you need to change it, add a breakpoint, debug the app, and step through the code, use the Mule debugger to view message properties, and pass query parameters to a request and locate them in the debugger. Let's get started. In Anypoint Studio, let's first figure out where the debug configuration lives. If you right-click on the APDev examples project, go down to Debug As, and choose Mule Application Configure, you'll find inside of here a Mule Debugger tab. Selecting the Mule Debugger tab will reveal the debugger port setting. Keep this location in mind. If we run the debugger exercise in a moment and debugger doesn't pop up or doesn't seem to connect, it could simply mean that you need to adjust this port accordingly. Oftentimes, I'll just increase the last digit or change it to all 7s. For now, I'm going to keep it as the default 6666, and instead of applying and hitting debug, let's hit close in this dialog. Now the reason I wanted you to close out of this dialog is oftentimes you won't go into the configuration window to run debug. Instead, just like running a normal project, you can right-click in the canvas, and instead of choosing Run, choose Debug. Let's try this now. Once we choose Debug, just like any other Mule application, the console should start spinning up the app. But this time, we should get a pop-up letting us know that we'd like to do a perspective switch. This means we're going to go into the Mule debug perspective over the Mule design perspective. Let's hit Yes. After hitting Yes, you'll notice your user interface changes just a bit. If you look in the top right of Studio, you'll see that you're now in the Mule debug perspective. You were previously in the Mule design perspective. Both are quite similar, but there are some subtle differences between the two. So, let's start off by minimizing the MUnit view since we won't be using that right now. Let's also go to the console and verify that our app started. Now that we know the app is started, let's put a breakpoint on the set payload processor. We can do this by right-clicking on set payload and choosing toggle breakpoint. Once the breakpoint has been toggled on set payload, let's go back to Postman and make the same request again. That request was localhost 8081/hello. We'll hit send inside of Postman, and you'll notice that Postman hangs in this case. It doesn't instantly get a response. If we return to Studio, we'll see inside of here that we're stopped at the set payload breakpoint. Now we can drill down and figure out what's going on. We can see some of those inbound settings we had seen previously in our log, such as where the HTTP listener path of the request came in. We can go to variables and see if there are any variables set, outbound properties, session variables, and record variables, seeing that all of these aren't set. We'll learn more about these very soon. On the left, we can see information about the payload and so on. Now, let's go to the next message processor. In the debug window, you'll see the curled arrow. Clicking the curled arrow will move you to the next processor, in this case, moving you across property. What this has done is executed the processor we were just on, which was set payload. A way we could prove this is by looking at the payload box in the left. We can now see the hello world message printed out inside of here, meaning that the payload had effectively been set when we stepped over this processor. Let's hit next again. And if you have your outbound tab selected here, you'll notice QP name gets added in the outbound scope. So now we can see the outbound property QP name being added. Let's go ahead and send this all the way through by clicking the green resume button. Next up, let's change our request a bit. In Postman, if we go in and add an extra query parameter in, so if we say name equals Max and type equals Mule and hit send, we'll go back to Anypoint Studio. And inside of Anypoint Studio for this request, if we select the inbound properties, you'll notice that there's now this HTTP query string inside of the debugger. If you expand the HTTP query params above that, there's actually a map of the key and value pairs for each parameter. You can imagine this being very helpful when we're having to utilize those values in our application. Another thing I'd like to show you is the expression evaluator. So if you click the x plus y equals question mark expression evaluator, inside of the expression evaluator box, let's see if we can access these query parameters. So first off, if we think back to that message model, we know the root context is the mule message, so we'll type in message. If we hit a dot here, we have a couple options, and if we remember that diagram, there were inbound properties and outbound properties. Well, the inbound properties are what we want in this case, since these are items that have been set by the inbound message source. And then if we do a dot at the end of message properties, using single quotes, we can put a key in. Now in the bottom right here, you can see the HTTP query params. So if we type in http.query.params, just like it shows in debugger, and hit enter, now we have full access to that map of values. And now we can just keep going. If we wanted to access the name specifically, we could come up here and put in .name, hit enter, and now we get the value of just the query parameter name. All right, we'll use this expression evaluator a lot more in class, but here's just a brief intro to it. We'll click in the canvas to get rid of it, and we'll click our green next button to move the item all the way through the project. Now, let's go back to our original Mule design perspective in the top right, and let's go ahead and stop the project. We can right-click inside of the project, and just like a running project, we can stop the debugging project. All right, and now that the project is stopped, let's continue on.